Welcome everybody to the IDRPP's Autism Echo. We are really glad that you have joined us today, the day before Thanksgiving. And our topic today is right on cue for picky eating, since tomorrow's a big eating day. We are recording our session, so you can always go and share the videos, any of the information shared in the session by sharing those videos or re-watching them to learn more. They are stored on our Canvas page as well as our YouTube channel. So by participating in the session, you're consenting to be recorded. We want to give a big shout out to the children with special health care needs at DHHS who help provide funding for this project. It's a great way partnership, and I'm just thrilled that we have their support on that. If you have never joined an Echo session, welcome to your first Echo session. Hopefully that you will continue to be a part of our Echo network. We will always have a subject matter expert, a case presentation where we do have all of you guys share all your great recommendations for that, which builds that professional networking. I know sometimes over Zoom it's hard to connect with people, but if we were all in person, we'd be contacting each other and chatting and getting each other's contact information. So over Zoom, those small breakout groups are how we try to facilitate that professional networking. We love the participation, so if you have any questions or comments, please put them into chat, and Colin Kingsbury, one of our amazing hub members, will be ensuring that those get answered. And Erin, our presenter today, is fine with us just asking in during her session. Another way to do that is also submit a case. I'm not kidding when I say that there are just such a wealth of information on this call, and to be able to get resources and recommendations of families or clients that you're working with is so fantastic. I always love when we don't have a case presentation because I get to then choose one of my families that I work with and present it, and I come back with a wealth of information for the families that I'm working with. When we are in this session, please just be respectful for the presenter. Either use chat or raise your hand. Please keep those questions brief and on topic. Think about introducing yourself and your organization before asking the question. Again, that's just building that professional networking. So when Stacy Fuller from Help Me Grow shares an amazing resource, I know who to reach out to do some follow-up questions. We do encourage that you turn on your camera. Again, if we were in person, there's no way to hide, right? So how do we connect with each other virtually? We do share information, again, about the families we work with or different situations. So please remember to protect the individual privacy. If you have any questions, please reach out to a hub member. We will all have an asterisk in front of our names, so we're easier to find in chat. We've all been on Zoom for a little bit, but if you have a question about renaming your profile or raising your hand, please reach out to myself or Leo, and we will help you navigate that. In order to get a credit of attendance, we do ask that you fill out those surveys. Leo will be dropping the survey link throughout today's session. And I just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to everybody who completes those. That is what we take back to our funding agencies to show the amazing work of this network. And during the survey, there is a question that asks for your name or contact information with your address. That is for us to be able to send thank you gifts to you. So if you would like some Echo swag, be sure to fill that out. And it's just a way to say thank you for completing those surveys. Canvas is where we store everything. So if you want access to our Canvas page, it's where we store our PowerPoints, our recordings, all the recommendations that are generated during our small breakout groups are stored on there. So you can always reach out to Autism Echo at aggies.usu.edu and we will get you access to our Canvas page. Just another plug for case studies. They are a great way to get resources and information. So if you're interested in doing a case presentation, please just reach out to Autism Echo at aggies.usu.edu and we will get you set up on our schedule with that. We do have social media, so if you want to take a minute to follow us on social media, we share information that is shared with us as well as all of our networks here at the IDRPP resources. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn the time over to Erin Forward, who will be our presenter today.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. And like we were saying, tomorrow being Thanksgiving, I feel like it is a very good time to talk about feeding, as it being a very food-centered holiday. I have a lot of conversations with a lot of my families this week and the week before about what to say to their families, how to advocate for their child, how to regulate themselves when the comments come and questions arise of why they're doing feeding the way that they are with their child and how to make it a positive experience. So we will talk a little bit about that today. I'm going to share it and then share again so that y'all can see. In regard to terminology, selective eating versus picky eating, a lot of the community has shifted a little more to the selective eating versus picky. Picky, we tend to use more with like a child that wouldn't get diagnosed with a pediatric feeding disorder. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of where that determination is. But we're going to talk about what you should know. What I will say is when I first started focusing on the autistic population in regard to feeding, I thought I was going to work with a bunch of feeding therapists and help them be more neurodiversity affirming and help them support autistic children. And then I realized that the people that were already connecting with autistic children were usually the ones that could best support them with feeding. It was just helping them feel comfortable in that realm. And so I have shifted a little bit because I feel like there's a lot of clinicians that have the tools and have the understanding and know how to support them, but are a little nervous when it comes to food and when it comes to feeding. So hopefully this will help you realize that you have the tools in your toolbox and give you the resources to feel a little bit more comfortable. Because a lot of the kids that we work with have so many providers, and feeding is about relationship. And so how can we foster that relationship to help in other areas? A little bit about me. I am an owner, a new owner of a private practice called Nourishing Connection LLC. I work in Charleston, South Carolina. I previously was at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and worked on their inpatient and outpatient team. I saw children that were discharged from the hospital and helped facilitate their feeding and augmentative communication, usually when they were discharged. And I was usually the therapist inpatient that saw all of the autistic children and helped support them while they were in the hospital. I am an expert DIR floor time provider, so I am a training leader, and that is woven through everything that I do. And I also have training in TBRI, which is trust-based relational intervention, which is a trauma-informed theory and philosophy developed by Karen Purvis out of TCU. And that's also been really integral into everything that I do, especially when it comes to feeding. I'm going to show a little video because I always like to kind of get your wheels spinning and dive into some more of the information. This is just a video of a feeding therapy session. I worked with this client for probably 6 months before we started feeding, which is something that I am a big proponent of, is easing into feeding because it is very intimate and you want to build a strong relationship before you start to address some of those things. Usually, that's not always the case or possible. But that's important to really understand a child's communication and cues before you present something that may be a little bit more challenging for them. And so this little boy, you'll see him throughout the presentation, but it was really important to utilize his strengths and how he liked to learn to support his learning about feeding. So I won't give too much information because I'll refer back to this video as we go through the presentation, but here's just a little opening for y'all. Let me know if anybody has trouble. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Oh, sorry, y'all. The video in Canva does give me a hard time sometimes.
It's an earthquake.
Here we go.
Sometimes he says stuff and it just sounds like he has an accent. I need brushing baby's hair.
Wow!
Giant book.
Giant fork.
Oh, it is a giant fork.
Little book.
A tiny fork. Oh, giant fork!
To rescue.
To the rescue.
It's an earthquake.
It's an earthquake. Oh no! Bum, 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 bum. It's an earthquake. Bum, 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 bum. Whew.
I love how he says that.
Hand.
Giant head.
A giant head.
Giant head.
Look, can we make look? Ready? Oh, it's a. Where is it? It's a giant ham. Oh, whoa. Tiny ham.
Me too.
Giant ham. Tiny ham. Ah!
Giant ham is here.
Giant ham is here. Tiny ham. Oh, you're gonna make a giant spoon?
Whoa, big spoon.
Whoa!
Giant spoon, big spoon, little spoon. Wait, it's small.
Small. Is it small now?
So I didn't give y'all much background behind that, but ham was a new food for him. And so we'll go back to and reference, and I'll show some more videos. But what I hope you get from this presentation today is how to follow a child's lead and follow their interests and follow how they like to learn and bring feeding into that. So I had no set plan of how I was going to try to encourage the exploration of that ham going into that session. But I saw where his brain was going and where he was building connections, and I kind of ran with it. And so I have more specific treatment ideas that I can show you, but I like to think outside the box. So as a relationship-based therapist, I do think it's important to know a little bit about who you're learning from. You heard a little bit of my bio, and I won't go into that because that's the more boring stuff. But I went into speech loving augmentative communication. That's why I went into speech. And then I fell in love with feeding in the home and working with Michelle Dawson, who is my mentor. And we did a podcast together for 8 years. And I learned so much from her. And then I started working with autistic children and found floor time. And I remember hearing from a lot of parents, it would be like 6 months into working with them, and they'd say, feeding's always been hard, but we didn't think anybody could help us. I would hear that over and over and over and over again. And to the point where they wouldn't even bring it up when I first started working with them because they felt discouraged. And when I started using the principles of floor time within the context of feeding, I saw so much growth and so much change. And when I used the concepts of floor time to learn more about that child and give them the space to learn about food in a way that helped them feel safe, it didn't feel like I had to work as hard. So that felt like a space that there needed to be a lot more information and education for a lot of us because I didn't want these parents to give up. I always say when I present that I'm building your lens. Everything that you do, every client I work with is a teacher to me. Every caregiver I work with is a teacher to me. Every course I take something from. Experiences in my life build my lens. We are who we are. We connect with who we connect with, and we learn from who we learn from. And that all builds this lens that we look through when we're observing a child. And so we all have different lenses and we all have different experiences, but people ask me all the time, what's your treatment? What's your treatment strategy? What do you do exactly? What do I need to do with this kid? And my answer is that the treatment is in the assessment. The treatment for that child is in what you observe about them, what you know about them, what you know about how their brain works. And that will give you the answer. I can't say to you, do this exact thing for every child or do this exact thing for this group of children because every child is different. So I can give you ideas, I can give you examples, I can give you information, but you are going to be the one that truly thinks outside the box to provide that those ideas and the strategies that will work for that kid. And you might get it wrong at first. I mean, I've made recommendations and the family's been like, that did not work. Or the child's been like, no. And that's okay. That's just information. I always use the metaphor, you can't turn an apple tree into a cherry tree. A lot of feeding therapy in the past, and a lot of therapy in the past, and still currently, is trying to change a child. But we can't turn an apple tree into a cherry tree. We need information from them. Plants, every plant tree needs different water, sunlight, fertilizer. These are all the supports that we need to figure out whether a child might need. And if we don't give them the right supports, it's not going to be an apple turning into a cherry. We're just not going to see the fruit of who a child really is. And so when it comes to feeding too, we have to be willing to step outside the box. A lot of our information about feeding is from a neurotypical lens of you sit at the table and you scoop the food and you have your food that's touching and you have conversations at the table. And that's great for some people. I enjoy that. I'm not neurotypical. I have late diagnosed ADHD, but I very much enjoy sitting at the table and engaging with my family. But for a lot of kids that we work with, that's not what works for their sensory system. That's not what works for their brain. And that's okay. And our job sometimes is to give them permission to follow their body and what works for them and to give caregivers permission. If you can't already tell, I love stories and I learn from stories. And this vacuum story is also one of my favorites, again, to get our wheels spinning as we go through some of the other information. But I worked with a child who, again, I started seeing him for language and communication for a while. Mom was a chef, actually. And so feeding was really important to her. But every time I would talk about food, bring up food, bring out food, he would say no and run away. Like it was very, very, I don't want anything to do with this. And so we didn't jump right into feeding. We worked on communication and he loved vacuums, loved reading the names of different vacuums, could tell you all types of vacuums, like to plug in the vacuum and hear the sound of the vacuum. He loved to pretend to use the vacuum, even though it was a little loud for his sensory system. And that was his most favorite thing. So I was sitting there as the therapist thinking, okay, mom wants me to work on feeding, but every time I do anything related to food, he runs away from me. What do I do? And so I thought about this child. What does he like about vacuums? I knew he liked the sound or thought it was interesting. I knew he liked plugging it in. I knew he liked having control. And I knew he liked he loved to read. He loved logos and things like that. He also loved watching videos. So I, through some trial and error, thought, what does a vacuum have to do with food? Or what does a vacuum have to do with the kitchen? And I thought about appliances. So we started learning about appliances in the kitchen. And we would watch videos of a blender. We would watch videos of other appliances in the kitchen that made noise, that had a timer. And so he got to learn about these parts that have some connection to food in an environment where he was separated from them. And he started to notice those appliances in his own kitchen and would start helping mom. What we did have to say to him was, you do not have to eat this food, or we're making it for dad, because we needed to separate the anxiety of like, am I going to be expected to eat this? And through months and months of this little window into the kitchen, he ended up trying the food that he ate for dad. He also ended up trying to make videos of himself cooking food, because I would make videos of myself cooking food to show him. And usually he didn't put the phone correctly, so it was just a video of the ceiling, but I could hear him trying to narrate what he was doing. And it just grew into him being this part of mealtime. Am I going to sit here today and say, introduce appliances to all of your kids? No, because this is a very specific scenario. But am I going to say that there are these little windows into learning about food that you and parents have the answer to? It's just finding that opening and being a little more curious about how they might want to learn about food. And it's tricky, and it's not something that you're going to read in a textbook, but it works. And we know a lot of the kids that we work with have these deep interests. So follow those deep interests and think about the why behind that interest. Something you also have to think about, and I'll talk about pediatric feeding disorders in that medical domain. But if you are working with autistic children with feeding, you cannot forget about the possible underlying medical etiologies. And unfortunately, a lot of the kids we work with get dismissed. And I've seen it happen all the time by doctors. It's not their fault. There's just a lack of education for a lot of them, but it oftentimes gets blamed on behavioral. And I will find the study. I didn't put it in here because studies just come to my brain sometimes, but there was a study done, and they found that 97% of feeding disorders were not behavioral. I would argue none of them are probably actually fully behavioral. And I will find the study and send it so that you guys have it, so you don't think I'm just pulling stuff out of nowhere. But usually it comes from something underlying. There is a much higher prevalence of GI etiologies in the autistic population. 85% of children with autism have some form of comorbid psychiatric diagnoses. So that can, whether that's anxiety, whether that's OCD, that can also impact our feeding. Sleep disorders are really big in the autistic population. If you're not sleeping well, that's going to affect you wanting to eat. That's going to affect your breathing. That's going to affect your chewing. EOE is eosinophilic esophagitis. If you haven't heard that term before, we're learning more and more about it. And there's a lot of autistic adults that are actually getting diagnosed with EOE. Essentially, it is an allergy, but it's in your esophagus. So a lot of these kids don't have, if you do like a skin test, it doesn't come off as an allergy. It's called a non-IgE allergy. And instead, these eosinophils that are in your stomach migrate up to their esophagus. And if you look up a picture of EOE on like Google, you'll see it looks like rings in their esophagus. It's really irritated. And so a lot of these kids, feeding is just really uncomfortable. And so some of the only signs sometimes of EOE are licking food and not wanting to swallow it, wanting to drink a lot, and then sometimes just refusals. And so I've worked with a lot of kids that it took years to get them diagnosed, because you have to do a scope and you have to take a biopsy. But it's something to think about. Allergies are really, really common in the autistic population. And I work with so many kids where they've gotten dismissed so often. And then when we dig a little deeper, there is this underlying medical component going on that makes them feel uncomfortable, that makes them not want to try new foods or explore foods that are not as easy to digest as well. So what types of foods do we oftentimes hear that a lot of our kids like to eat? Bland, and processed. And sometimes that's because they're consistent. So those foods are always taste the same. A blueberry does not always taste the same. A carrot does not always taste the same. Meat is not always cooked the same. Mom's casserole sometimes is oversalted. At least my mom, she's a decent cook, but sometimes it was oversalted. Those processed foods are the same. They're also easier to digest. When I'm anxious, I want a grilled cheese with like Velveeta processed cheese because it's easier for my gut to digest it. Whereas some of those vegetables and fruits, they're really good for our gut microbiome, but they can be really uncomfortable for kids who aren't used to having that variety. So most of my kids I work with, I do like to see a GI, but I am particular about the GI because I don't want them to feel dismissed. Dr. Kara Margolis, and I have this presentation, and if you go to the link, she has a free hour presentation. It's amazing. She's fantastic. She's out of New York, and she works specifically with the autistic population and writes up a lot of papers and has done a lot of studies. And she talks about having a lower threshold for assessment for them because she says with difficulties with interoception and a lot of the kids that we work with knowing exactly where something hurts in their body or how they feel, she's more likely to test them than maybe somebody who is neurotypical. GI issues are 4 times more common in autism than their neurotypical peers, according to her research. She also talks about how due to sensory differences, it might not signal as gut pain. It can most often be seen as injurious behaviors. So I work with a lot of kids where when their gut feels uncomfortable, they're hitting their head or they're doing something else just to stop the pain, but they can't exactly tell us where it is. And so being more sensitive, when I have a kid that shows up one day and they're more aggressive or they seem really off or they're more dysregulated, my first thought isn't, oh, you're regressing or something. My first thought is, what's going on? Are you uncomfortable? Are you about to get sick? What happened? What happened with your day? And so diving a little bit deeper into the why behind we're seeing those. But that's important to think about. And I had a little boy I worked with who I didn't see him until he was 4, and he would hit himself in the head a lot. He seemed really uncomfortable. He would only eat Chick-fil-A sandwiches because they were consistent and Pediasure, and come to find out he had pretty severe EOE when we did a scope. It's not to say every kid that engages in those behaviors has something GI going on, but it's a factor to think about, especially if you're seeing differences in their feeding that are really significantly impacting the family. Like for this child, mom was having to go and get Chick-fil-A sandwiches at 10:30 every single morning because that's all that he would eat. And that was a big stressor for all of them. Let's see. So just so we all have the right terminology and we're all on the same page, PFD is pediatric feeding disorder. The name of that diagnosis came out in a paper by Gadea et al. In 2018. If you haven't heard of Feeding Matters, they're a really amazing organization that was started by a mom who had triplets who couldn't find feeding support. And so if I've ever thought something needed to get done, I've never doubted that a mom could be the one to do it. So she started this nonprofit, and they came together because they wanted there to be a consensus and a diagnosis for research to be coupled together for people to feel understood. A lot of it was like feeding difficulties or dysphagia, swallowing differences, which didn't always apply for a lot of these kids. And so the diagnosis of PFD is impaired oral intake that is not age appropriate and is associated with medical, nutritional, feeding skill, and or psychosocial dysfunction. They originally in the article found 1 in 37 children under the age of 5 each year had a diagnosis of PFD. Right now, that's going up in numbers because of just better understanding. But they use non-age appropriate, not to be ableist, but just to make sure that people get the support that they need if they want it. And so they have 4 domains. In order to have a PFD diagnosis, and speech therapy and OT can diagnose a pediatric feeding disorder if there's a feeding skill component. So you only have to have differences in one of the domains, or you can have all 4. So when I assess a child, I'm looking for what's going on in each of these domains because they can impact their feeding. And it's also helpful because it gives us a framework to think about all the different areas that can be impacted by feeding. That's not to say that every child who has feeding differences needs therapy, and every child that has a PFD needs therapy. I work with a lot of kids and parents that are really happy with where their children are and have accepted and don't have anxiety and stress around food. And that's really the goal. What I say to families is if feeding is stressful for you or your child, that's really when we need feeding therapy, because sometimes my job is just to help a family understand their child and to work on that relationship at mealtime. Sometimes kids are going to have a lower number of foods, and that's okay. That works for their sensory system and that works for them. And as long as they're getting enough of their macro and micronutrients to grow, like, I'm good with that. And shifting that perspective too of, I work with a registered dietitian, and she's like, chicken nuggets and pizza are actually pretty whole foods for macro and micronutrients. And that's okay if that's how they're going to get their nutrients. Being comfortable with that, and also getting out of our own head, which can be hard because feeding is very intimate for a lot of us. And we all have our own food stuff, as Dr. Jillian Bordeaux talks about. So keeping all of those in mind is really helpful, because sometimes a feeding skill issue is actually a medical issue and we just don't know. And so my old mentor used to say, chase the swallow. I don't have time to get into all of that, but she does have a book called Chasing the Swallow, which is very helpful for looking at some of those medical etiologies. I do not get paid at all for that book if you buy it. That's just full disclosure. I just like the book. Why may an autistic child be a picky eater? Because it's important to know the why. If you don't know why, how are you treating and supporting them? You could be treating and supporting them in a way that's not actually making this any better because I don't understand. Sensory can be a big piece of that, but not just sensory of texture of food. We have to look at their whole sensory system, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Medical, like we talked about, emotional and relationship. For a lot of kids that were very colicky when they were younger, or you'll hear parents say he was very colicky, he cried a lot. Sometimes that can be a difference in attunement and attachment. So sometimes the autistic kids that we work with as infants need to be soothed differently than their neurotypical peers. And the child and the caregiver is doing the best that they can, but they need so much more sensory input, or they need to be bounced the whole time to fall asleep because of their differences in their brain. And so that in feeding, we can see a lot if feeding doesn't fully soothe them and they still need a lot of sensory input even after a bottle, and they're crying and the caregiver is, trying to attune to their needs, but it's hard because their needs are very different. That can impact feeding. Interoception challenges. If I have a really hard time knowing where my body is in space, I have a hard time motor planning what to do with my body. It's also probably going to be really hard for me to know when I'm hungry. It's going to be hard for me to know when I'm thirsty. It's going to be hard for me to know when I have to go to the bathroom. That can impact what I want to eat. And maybe by the time I feel hungry, I only want to eat the foods that help me, that feel safe to me. Core strength. So many of the autistic kids that we work with have differences in their core strength. There's a lot of research to show that there is some asymmetry in their body as well. And so how many kids do we work with where they overstuff? They just put a bunch of food in their mouth. Sometimes that's because I need the sensory input. Sometimes that's because it's a lot of effort for me to sit at this table with my core strength. And so I kind of want it to be over. So I put a bunch of food in my mouth and then I don't really know what to do. So can we give them more support sometimes? What are ways from positioning? Even if we can't, it's not as obvious, that could be a factor. And then engagement. If you're working with a child who isn't super interested in what you're doing, they have the way that they want to play, and that connection, relationship, engagement piece is something that they have some growing edges with. we may be giving children opportunities with food, but it may not be meaningful to them. So you may be putting food in front of them 15 times, like parents get told, it takes 15 exposures sometimes to help a child want to eat a food. But if it's not meaningful to them, I don't call that an exposure or an opportunity. So you get a lot of parents that say, I keep putting the new food in front of them. I'm always offering what we have, but that's not something that they're truly engaging with. So how can we help them engage with the food in a way that is more in a line with how they learn? Because that can be really frustrating for parents when they get a lot of that same advice. But we have to know why. You might not always know why, but we have to be thinking about the why. Because the other cool thing about feeding is that when you support a lot of these other areas, sometimes feeding just gets better on its own. Not always, but if you dig a little bit deeper and I support their sensory system, I support their relationship, I support their engagement, you would be surprised how much feeding also improves. And if it doesn't improve, I would go back to medical and think, what am I missing about your body? We also have been hearing a lot more about ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. What I will say is that ARFID and pediatric feeding disorder, you used to hear that you couldn't have both of those diagnoses at the same time, and that if there was anything medical going on, it wasn't ARFID. That is not the case anymore. And you will work with children that will qualify for pediatric feeding disorder and ARFID. ARFID has to be diagnosed by a physician or a psychologist, which can be challenging because it's oftentimes challenging to find a psychologist in general, let alone a psychologist that specializes in working with children that have feeding differences. But ARFID is a mental health diagnosis. Talk about children with feeding problems and nutritional risk or deficiency without body image problems such as anorexia. So this is more of an anxiety around food that doesn't have to do with how I'm observing my body. And so it can be really helpful for families and other professionals to better understand and support a child knowing that this is an anxiety piece, but it's also really encouraged to not dismiss any possibility of something medical going on just because they have an ARFID diagnosis. And sometimes it could be something medical that has resolved, and then there's an underlying anxiety and distrust around food that continues. But still having that understanding is important. And we might not always know, but my only fear with an ARFID diagnosis sometimes is that it stops there of seeing if there is something else going on that's making them uncomfortable. That's the wrong way. Feeding Matters is really great. Like I said, Two Sides of the Spectrum podcast with Marsha Dunn Klein is one of my favorite podcasts. And I really love it because there's a lot of feeding therapists out there that are saying that they're shifting to neurodiversity affirming care, but they're not telling us how. And Marsha Dunn Klein does a really great job of talking about how and why and where she shifted. She has the get permission approach. She's wonderful. And I really love the learning through her learning and her vulnerability with what she's done. She also, if you go to her website on the Get Permission approach, she has interviews with autistic adults. And so she interviews them about their feeding experience to really learn from their own lived experiences of what worked for them, what didn't, how we can start to use that information to better us, especially with the children that aren't able to express that in the same way as their adult counterparts. And then Noreen Hunani is a registered dietitian. She's really, really wonderful and really supportive of advocating for the autistic community when it comes to feeding and when it comes to shifting our perspective of what that should look like. When it comes to talking about how kids learn about food, I talk about mealtime literacy, which is a term I developed because I couldn't find something that matched what I was talking about. But we want to think about a person's understanding of mealtime and how they want to engage with food, which is tricky. None of this is easy. None of this is a protocol or a textbook for what to do. But we have to think about like what their understanding of mealtime is. And that can look very different because a lot of kids we work with like I talked about, might be seeing this food that their parents are eating over and over again. It might be on their plate. They might be exposed to it, but they may in their head be thinking, well, that's their food and this is my food. And how do we bridge that? This can also be my food. Or how do we bridge that? I want to learn about this food. Because feeding is something that a lot of us seek control over, especially when we're dysregulated or our world doesn't feel safe. And so we have to give grace with that it is okay to have safe food and it is okay for feeding to be a place where you just want to feel safe. And then we also want to presume competence in saying, you may want to explore other foods. You may want to learn about foods in other ways. You may have this interest in cooking in the kitchen, but it might have to look different with how you learn. So we have to dive into what their mealtime literacy is. And the goal is to build a pathway to curiosity that's unique to their individual profile. For example, when I try a new food, I like to smell it first, which was when I was younger and we would go to restaurants and they bring the bowl of bread out that had like different types of breads, I would want to smell it. And my nana would tell me that wasn't polite, but I needed to smell it to feel safe to eat it. Some people need to feel the texture or need to touch it. Some people looking at it gives them enough information. There are other strategies that have very specific protocols, and that can be really tricky when our sensory systems are all different. And so the goal is, how do I help this child find their pathway to learning about food? Some kids will watch a TV show with their favorite character will eat a food and they trust that character enough that that's enough for them to try the food. I've had so many kids where like Bluey ate this food, so we watched the video of Bluey eating the food and they were totally comfortable to try it because that was their window in. Some kids want to see a logo of a picture of the food, and then we find the logo in the store and we write it and we color it, and then we're willing to try it because we've understood that food in a different way. And again, this is all tricky to figure out what works for them, but it's gonna look different. And we've had a lot more research to understand that autistic play can look different. But if autistic play can look different, autistic feeding can also look very different. What we need to consider with autism, protocols don't work usually. Very strict protocols for feeding, because no kid is a protocol and feeding is so emotional and intertangled that there's so many other factors that we have to keep in mind. Every child is different. We need to be trauma informed and neurodiversity affirming when it comes to feeding. Feeding's really personal. And we know that a lot of the children we work with already experience a lot of trauma just in their world. And so I'm going to be very sensitive to a no. I'm going to be very sensitive to their communication during mealtime. And that's not me being a conservative therapist. That's just me wanting to teach them that they have self-advocacy when it comes to food, and that they have a right to choose and be in charge. And what I tell families too is, when you honor the no, they're so much more likely to come back. I had a kid I worked with who, it's a little different, but he had a brain tumor and went through surgery. And then I worked with him when he left the hospital. And our first session, he came in for 5 minutes and he was crying and upset and said, all done, and said no. And I said, it's okay if we end our session after 5 minutes today. And she's like, our session's an hour. And I said, if I honor his no, he's going to be more likely to come back. And he came back that next day or that next week, and he was way more comfortable because he knew that he had control and that I wasn't going to force him to do something that he didn't like. These are just some components of neurodiversity affirming therapy, which I like to include, because when I look at my therapy, I like to make sure that I am monitoring it and seeing if I'm abiding to this collaboration and making things very individualized. And when it comes to trauma-informed care, I want to make sure I'm making them feel safe first. I want to make sure they're collaborating, that they have choices. Giving kids as many choices as possible is really, really important for feeding. And then neurodiversity affirming care falls under trauma informed care because it's that cultural component. neurodiversity is a culture. So we want to keep that in mind as well. Regulation is huge for feeding. If a child is really dysregulated, I'm probably going to expect that they're only going to want to eat their safe foods, because my gut and my body is in this fight or flight mode and my digestion is not working in the same way. And so if a child is dysregulated, it's going to be hard to feel hunger. If they're dysregulated, it's going to be hard to engage and intake information. If they're dysregulated, it's going to be challenging for them to communicate their wants and needs. So we need to focus on relationship first. We need to focus on regulation before we can expect them to get curious about food and trying new food. Like I said, you already have the tools. You already know these things about the children you're working with, but let's find some windows in. My theory for this is that at 6 months, a child starts eating solids typically, or baby food. They play with their food, their hands get messy, they develop their tactile, their gustatory systems, they're learning about food when it touches their hands of what it's going to do in their mouth. They also put toys in their mouth at the same time. So they're learning about their world in a way that they're learning about food. And they get messy, we have these experiences. A lot of the children we work with learn about food, and their world in the same way. It just looks different when they're older and when they have different interests. So we have to make things meaningful. If I have a child whose primary play schema with toys is throwing them, that's how they learn about toys. They throw it, they learn about the affordance of the object because it's either heavy to throw or it makes a sound or it bounces. Like, this is how I'm taking in information of my world. I'm probably going to have them throw food. And that can be a hard sell for some parents because it gets messy. But that's how they're building pathways in their brain. That is how they're building connections. So my job is to figure out, how are you building connections and how can this translate to food? If I have a child who's working and really loves to line up their toys by color, they're really interested in colors. Maybe we'll find food that has different colors. Maybe the goldfish with different colors, we're going to line that food up. And I will tell you, kids know what's food and what's not food. And when they are ready, they will put it in their mouth. If you are having to force a child to put food in their mouth or say, do this, then take a bite, we're missing something. Might not be medical necessarily, but we're missing something. And I'm a firm believer of that, because that is also not sustainable for the child or the family. Making a caregiver sit there and say, do this, then get this, or you get a sticker or something like that, that's not building their intrinsic motivation. And when the reward goes away, they're not going to take the bite and they're not going to eat it. And so if we want our children to be autonomous and, support themselves and learn their own body cues, we're going to have to work a little bit harder to make sure it's meaningful. And I encourage you, with the children that you work with, and this comes from Floor Time, which is DIR, development, individual differences, and relationship. I encourage you to start to make charts of a child's individual differences. You may not have all the information. It took me a long time to learn more about their sensory system, but what do I know about their sensory system? If I'm as a speech therapist, I might talk with the OT. What do I know about their trauma? What do I know about their family? What do I know about their communication? What do I know about their motor planning? Feeding is all encompassing. So if I'm trying to get a child to try a new food, but motor planning of spoon feeding is hard for them, I'm probably not going to make them use the spoon while they're trying their new food, because that's putting one challenging thing on top of the other. And so the more I know about them, the better I can support their feeding. I know a kid needs a lot of vestibular input and a lot of proprioceptive input, and they need to move their body. Maybe we'll try feeding on a swing. Within the context of being careful about, obviously, their chewing and swallowing, because I don't want, we don't need any choking, but maybe they need that input to be able to focus on you and what you're doing. Maybe they need to be swinging and I'm having a snack. Those are simple things that, because I know things about them, maybe open their eyes a little bit to that experience. Think about your favorite food. My favorite food is the greens and beans that my papa used to make. And I love greens and beans, but they're my favorite food because my papa used to make them. A lot of our foods have this connection to a person or a memory. I often will ask parents, like, tell me if you remember when your child first felt safe with a food. A lot of times they'll say to me that it was like we were on vacation and we were in a new restaurant and they tried this new thing. I have a whole presentation on like gestalt language processors and feeding because of the way that they process their world. But sometimes taking a kid out of an environment is really helpful to open their eyes to something new. Because if I'm a little more rigid and structured in my meal time with my safe foods, maybe we have a picnic on the floor and you're a little more open to trying new foods. If a child has trauma, a lot of the times I work with parents that had no other choice than to essentially force their child to eat food because they didn't receive the help that they needed. And so working through some of that psychosocial piece and some of the guilt too is really important. But for a lot of those kids, sitting at the table can be really stressful. So if I take you away from the space where it was traumatic for you, your body can start to relax because our body remembers. So I do a lot of picnics. I do a lot of eating on the floor. I do a lot of letting kids eat on the counter, um, because being above a child is a bit of a power move. So a lot of children do feel safe when they're above you. Um, those same kids that they let on the counter will still sit in the chair at the table, especially at school, because I know that's a fear from a lot of parents and people that like, are they going to um, stand on the table everywhere that they go? And oftentimes they don't. Um, we have to hold a child's safe foods with a lot of care. I don't want to make a safe food unsafe. And so tricking a child, changing things in their safe food, or trying to swap their chicken nuggets for another chicken nugget is putting that family at risk to lose more foods. And so if I am going to do something like introduce a new chicken nugget, oftentimes I will eat the new chicken nugget or have it on a plate next to the ones that they already have, and I will tell them. I will be transparent because they know, especially our kids that are incredibly visual. And so holding those in regard and not trying to change them too much is really important. I'll skip that one. So first, we need to help a child feel comfortable. We need to understand their mealtime and what works for them before we can change it. We talked a little bit about that. We need to build relationship. We learn in the context of relationship. That's what DIR floor time talks about. Sensory is incredibly regulating, but the fastest way to regulate a child is through relationship, from your right frontal lobe to your amygdala. And the autistic children, it's been found that they have bigger amygdalas oftentimes. And so their emotions, that's why we see bigger feelings. That's why we see bigger emotions a lot of times. And so that strong relationship can be incredibly regulating. And if we haven't built the relationship with feeding yet, what I will often do is coach the caregiver. So if I'm still building that relationship, but I don't feel like they feel safe enough with me, that's when the caregiver and I are talking about what can we change at home? What can we do at home? What can we try? Because again, it's very personal and I don't want to cause any more trauma or stress. Cheers, super simple way to build connection at mealtime or help a child feel like they're a part of something.
Okay.
This is my nephew. He learned how to eat this challenging food, a celery, that's like really hard for him to bite, but he was super motivated because mom tried it and he watched mom try it, which is the value of connection and relationship. This is not to do with food, but I haven't run a mile in months. And my dad came down for a 5K that I told him I was going to train for. I ran the 3 miles without stopping, not because I was in shape, but because I was in a relationship with my dad and I felt safe with him. And so we can do much harder, more challenging things when it's in relationship with somebody else. And there's a lot of neurobiology to support that as well.
Are you eating? Do you want some? Are you all done? Oh, I'm sorry. There you go.
She is on the floor because this child had a lot of medical complications, a heart attack after an airway surgery, and had a lot of stress in the high chair. So we put her in a place that she felt safe, and we honored all of her cues. And she would show us when she was ready within the context of this really safe relationship. In order for a child to try a new food, they have to be curious. Dr. Jillian Bordeaux is fantastic. If you also haven't seen, she did an episode recently on Two Sides of the Spectrum about children with PDA profile more specifically, but she talks about when children feel, she has 3 different processes that impact a child's behavior and like where fear comes from, which was really insightful. And so I highly recommend you listen to her. But when I talk to her, she talks about how curiosity is a luxury cognitive process. We cannot feel curious until we feel comfortable. And so until a child feels comfortable and safe at mealtime, I'm not really going to expect them to want to try new foods or get curious about them. And so that's something we have to think about.
Like that's normal.
Cue reading is really important for feeding and can be really, really, really subtle. So being really responsive to some of those changes, because a lot of children will breathe really heavy or change their muscle tone or their pupils will dilate in response to something, and they don't always know why. And so if we can give meaning to that, that can also help them feel more safe in the moment. This little boy is one of the children that I worked with, and this is not my favorite therapy moment of mine. Mom really needed to talk, but I don't like to talk about kids in front of them. But you can see in the video him show some of these. His eyes kind of divert.
Like blue.
Yeah, like it's not like he's like, it seems like he's
He takes a really deep breath.
tired. Now he does go to bed a lot easier because he's already
Thinking about.
calm.
I can go home.
Hey. Was mommy did you hear mommy talking about that? Because you know what's going on. We're still.
So he shows like all of these signs of being uncomfortable because we're talking. He thinks he has to go home. And they're really subtle if you're not paying attention. But if we notice these things in mealtime and acknowledge them and make meaning out of them, that child can feel safer in that moment. And co-regulation is really, really challenging at mealtime. It's really, really challenging, especially if we have our own food stuff, as Jillian would say, and giving the caregivers also permission that they don't have to be perfect all the time at mealtime, and they can acknowledge if they've had a hard day or they're really hungry or things are moving too fast, and that's okay. I will say, let's see. When we're thinking about these strategies, I want you to think about how the child you work with plays and how they really play and how they're building connections. And that can look like we read a story about feeding because he really likes to read, and then we make the food that they read in that story. That can look like he really likes to write, and we just start to write the names of food. And then maybe after we write the names of food, we show a picture of the name of food. That can look like a child who, I evaluated a child the other day who has a lot of anxiety around food, and he really loves bugs. And he's really visual. So I talked to him about, I was like, I wonder if we could make food look like bugs, because he liked to draw. And he was like, that's a great idea. We could use 2 marshmallows, and then we could put 2 M&Ms for their eyes, and we could use pretzels as legs, which like I didn't even know that he knew all of these sorts of foods. And then we could make a like cookbook about it to show other kids how to make it. And so it was giving him these meaningful opportunities to touch food and smell food and be around food, but in a way that wasn't making him feel like he had to eat the food. And so attuning to that child can be as simple as this mom. It's good? Rating food and laughing and smiling with him. Because now, whether he ate that food or not, his body and his brain had a positive experience in the context of that new food. And that in and of itself is really, really valuable. I know I talk too much, so let me see if there's anything else that is super, super important before I.
Okay.
Yeah, think about how they play. Think about watching them, just sitting back and watching them and seeing how they're building connections and what is it that's connecting this idea to this idea, and how can I maybe use that to connect this food to this food. Another child I was working with recently, he loves to make food in the kitchen, and mom said, I asked him to go grab something in the living room and he didn't know what the living room was, so I had to say the couch. And so what that told me that maybe these bigger general concepts were a little bit more challenging for him. And so how do I help him? Maybe that's why feeding was a little harder for him, because a tomato is a tomato, but I don't necessarily categorize it with vegetables. So maybe I don't see any connection between a tomato and a cucumber. And maybe my connection is visual. Another child I'm working with decided to try broccoli because mom was cooking broccoli and I don't know, I'm not quite sure where it came from. And he's lining up his toys based on colors right now. So red toys, green toys, purple toys. So what's our idea with food? We like broccoli. Let's find some green vegetables and see if we can build some connections between those, because that's how you're building connections in other areas. And so, yes, this is all very outside of the box, but it's all right in front of you if you take the time to watch them. And there are those pathways to learning more about that food. I have some videos too. Maybe I'll send, I have some videos on my YouTube channel that might be helpful. Like this video of this little boy who liked to line up trains, and that's how we played. And so we started lining up food on the train. Food he liked first, and then we tried food that was new to him, and I would line it up on my train, and he eventually felt comfortable to line it up on his train. And guess what? I didn't even have to say anything, but he would try them on his own when he was ready, and we could transfer it to the table eventually, because like I said, kids know what's food and what's not food, and especially our kids that are putting toys in their mouth but not food, there's a reason, and if we can make it meaningful, it can usually switch.
Erin,
Sorry, I had to run through those last ones. Yeah.
You can take the time, and then we're just going to open it up to ask you questions about the kids we work
Perfect.
with. So
amazing. I only have a couple more, so I won't. This little boy was one of the boys I worked with who had a diagnosis of EOE. And so he liked to throw things and he loved water play. So what did we do? We built a play schema around water in order to help him feel comfortable knowing what was going to happen and knowing how to explore. And then when we felt comfortable around water, we brought in pudding, which was a new food. And so what happened was, for a lot of our kids too, if you can make these play schemas of like how I learn about something, you can start to bring in new food because the play schema is familiar to them. And that's what mealtime is to us. Like we sit at the table and either we scoop the food from family style or the plate comes out in front of us. That's our mealtime schema. For a lot of kids we work with, that doesn't work. And so we have to develop other schemas. And he was a kid that needed a lot of sensory input, that liked to jump, that liked proprioceptive input. He needed to be like in relationship with someone. And so we created this, let's play outside, let's explore outside, let's get it all over our body, like the 6-month-old that might be exploring it. And we were able to add in new foods because there was some level of comfort with the relationship, with what was going to happen. It got really messy. And I bought mom cleaning supplies for Christmas, but he felt comfortable. And when the food became safe to him, he was able to eat it at the table. So for a lot of kids, trying the new food, we had a different environment for, and then once it felt safe and comfortable to them, they could bring it to the table, or they could bring it to wherever they wanted to eat, if that was on the floor or on the couch. I mean, I eat on my couch all the time. I live by myself, so like there's nobody else to eat with. But I think we put difficult standards on kids when we don't even do it ourselves. Also, think about how you eat your food when no one's around. Like we I see parents, understandably so, like at a restaurant, get upset with a kid for like using their finger to get the sauce from the bowl, but like I do that when no one's watching. And so some of our kids are a little more free. And so thinking like, okay, but to be fair, how do I eat when like no one's watching me? I mean, I do different things than I would when there's people around me. This little boy loved to read. And so we read books about food. We wrote food words. We printed out pictures of logos. That's how we learned about food. And then we would take the pictures and I would buy whatever food had that logo. And we would explore it eventually, but it had this familiarity for him because reading was his strength and visualization was his strength. And so we used that to support his learning about food. I make cringy videos of myself
on the blender.
Cooking.
It might be kind of noisy, so I got to prepare myself. Push start.
Because think about the noise could surprise them. What the steps we're supposed to take. So I would make videos, and I still make videos of me cooking food, and I talk about it, and I give language, and I sing songs, and it again allows children to learn about food without the whole sensory experience being there. And so before we would make a food in the session, I would make a video of myself making it, and I would send it to the parents, kind of like a visual social story, so that they knew what was going to happen. And that seemed to be really, really helpful. Like I said, look at packaging, make a cookbook of their favorite foods. Oh, sorry, you've seen this video so many times. Make a cookbook of how to make their favorite characters with food, color pictures of food. I used to be the feeding therapist that thought if food wasn't in the session, I couldn't bill for it. And that's just not true. Learning about how to describe food is really helpful for kids because how do I even know what salty means? Do I even know what sweet means? Do I even know what crunchy means? Do I know what it's going to do when I put it in my mouth? Kids need to learn those things, but they need to learn it in a way that's meaningful for them. Here's my email. If y'all want to email me. What was I gonna say? I lost it. Sorry if that was a whirlwind. I do like a full 18-hour course, so I try to put it in an intro, but yeah, what
so now we have Erin graciously staying on with us. And so we are gonna just let you guys ask any questions. So ask the expert any questions you have for her, and you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you, or you can put it in chat.
Are we overwhelmed? How are we feeling? Are we I like to pulse check the room. I like to co-regulate the room.
So
jump in. I thought this was amazing, amazing. I loved your organization, your experience, your videos, and I've been on many feeding webinars, and this was really outstanding. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'll certainly go look at those videos. I think I've been at this a while and I've never made a video and sent it ahead of time. So I thought that's a really great takeaway.
Make mistakes too. I'm very clumsy and I like will spill things a lot in my videos, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not. But to like give some vulnerability, especially for our really anxious kids, can be very helpful because a lot of them are like afraid to make a mistake. And so in my videos, I will purposefully and not purposefully make mistakes so that they're already like comfortable with that.
Yes. I have a question. I definitely understand the relationship building, and I have a student who's 10 years old diagnosed with ARFID, and I'm working collaboratively, I guess, within the last 6 months with a mental health provider. So that's great. We have a lot of stories about getting stuck in the mud and rigid thinking and reading a book on feelings and rigidity, like flexible thinking like a palm tree versus stiff and firm and like an oak tree. But what I am sometimes seeing, and we're going slowly, and that's important to celebrate those achievements and participation. But sometimes I get stuck a little bit with thanks, but I'm not going to try it, or he'll try something with me, and it's not carried over into, let's say, the two different homes that he lives in. So I know a little bit about family-based therapy, and I'm recommending that for the parents, but any other ideas that I might need to consider?
That's a good question. And I think the tricky part with that is those are all wonderful strategies, but for a lot of our kids too, we're teaching them those strategies when they have full access of their brain. And then in the moments where they're working from their lower brain, they can't access that cognitive piece of like what, all those things that we've talked about. And so that's where, and this is shameless plug for floor time, where I love floor time because you work in play to facilitate some of those experiences when they're more in the moment. And so it can maybe be from role playing of them being something else and getting upset, or you modeling you feeling upset about something and them working through it. It's also I feel like in a lot of those moments, sensory can be really helpful too if we're not able to access that cognitive piece. So like what are things that like if my body starts to feel a certain way, I can do to my body. And so sometimes we have to go body first as opposed to like I need to think about myself this way. And sometimes it they don't even know what's happening. Like my stomach hurts or my head hurts. And so trying to help them identify too, like how does your body feel? How do you know when you feel this way? And what's something that makes your body feel better can also be really helpful. Because sometimes it's, when I'm anxious, like I can't even find the words to explain how I'm feeling. And so then it's hard for me to access those really great strategies because it's just I kind of shut down.
That's excellent. Yeah, just something that I'm going to share for other viewers that might find it helpful. Um, he enjoys pretending he's a scientist, so we have all these science experiments that we do and taste test challenges, and um, so that's kind of fun. But this
Yeah.
answer
Those
this.
are great ideas. So
Hmm.
Stephanie Sogla has her hand up for our next question.
Yeah, so I work with up to three early intervention in Utah. And so most of the kids that I work with are like 2 years old. A lot of them are nonverbal.
Hmm.
One kid in particular that I'm thinking about it's even especially hard to get him engaged with anything. And so we're trying to figure out like, is he just not interested? Is it a food issue? Is it, a GI issue? Is it a like sensory things. So is there kind of like a try this and then this and then this and then this, or kind of where do we start figuring out and what kind of path do we take until we figure out what's the main issue?
Hmm. Is he engaged with you in other ways, or is his engagement with you not quite there even without the context of food?
I've only been working with him for a couple of months, but he does some engagement with songs. He'll do some
Hmm.
engagement with, he likes like the building block Legos
Yep.
and stacking things.
Okay. So I would think I would want to, if those were the things that he's the most interested in, I would try like there's some of those fun like feeding songs of like, the do you like broccoli or do you like ice cream?
Oh, okay.
And then they like mix the broccoli ice cream together. And so I would start like finding food songs and seeing if he has any interest in them, or like anything like that. And then could you find food that you stack together, or could you even stack boxes of food if we're not quite ready to touch the food? Like how can, and so that's a good way to think of like, how does he like to play? And then let's bring food into it. And if you don't see any interest, then yeah, I would explore some of those other areas too, just to, I always tell parents, I'm a person who likes to rule things out. Like I don't want to give them more medical intervention than they need, but I also want to make sure that we're not missing something. And sometimes it can just, sometimes GI can be helpful because you can see a registered dietitian. Also, they don't need to do a blood test. They can do a hair test. So if they tell you that they need to do a blood test, you can tell them that you know they can do a hair test and they don't have to.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
See, the answers are all there, you know? I always say, think about what they like, think about who they are, think about what they're intrigued by. Some kids' sensory systems, I want to think about what sensory system is regulating and calming for them, and then what sensory system they're also attracted to, like what pulls them in. And those two things together can be a really cool combination. Like if proprioceptive is really helpful for them, they need to move their body, but they're super attracted to visual. How do I incorporate both of those into their feeding? If I know more about that, I can also help parents understand like they need to move around and then come back and take a couple bites, and that's okay.
So while we're waiting for somebody, oh, it looks like Ashley. Okay.
Yeah, so my daughter's almost 6 years old and she struggled with feeding like her whole life.
Mm-hmm.
I had to hand feed her till she was like probably 4 years old before she would actually use a spoon. But like all she would eat for like 2 or 3 years was eggs every single day, every meal. And now it's everything with cheese. Like all she wants is pizza, or quesadillas, or whatever it is. And she likes lots of sugar. But it's like affecting her health really bad. Her eczema's like out of control. Like she has red, raw sores on her arms now. And we're going to take her to the doctor next week, but it's like starting to affect her health really bad.
Yeah. I'm sorry. That's so, oh, go ahead. Keep going.
Her autism it's better than it was since she started school last summer, or this year actually. So she's like a level 1, mild to no symptoms, which is really great. But she has really a lot of sensory things like input that she needs. So she's always moving around, like she cannot focus at all. So it's like feeding is so stressful and so hard for us.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I know that's hard to share. And, you know, it sounds like you've been such a good advocate for her and you've really listened to what she needs. And I think I obviously can't give any like medical advice or anything like that, but it is interesting because I work with a lot of kids who have, and I don't know if she does, but I work with a lot of kids who have allergies and they like to eat a lot of food that they're allergic to still. It's almost like our gut microbiome. If we keep eating the food, it doesn't affect us as much. It's almost like we're putting kind of like Band-Aids on it. And then if we stop eating it, like if you think about if you stop eating meat and then you go back to eating meat, you don't have that gut microbiome to break it down. And so sometimes even if food isn't the most comfortable, if it's what we know and we keep eating it, it feels okay. And so, and I'm sure with her poor thing with her skin, like that can also affect your sensory system too. If like that's more sensitive too, you might need even more input. And my thing is always like, you both deserve to feel more comfortable within the context of feeding too. And so I would I would be curious what could help make that better for her. And I wish I had an answer.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Sorry, go ahead, Ashley.
She was so overwhelmed, like this last December, like she was literally like having a mental breakdown and like literally bouncing off the walls. And like I just remember her, she was in the closet and just like touching everything and like pulling clothes down and like touching the walls, like she was going out of her mind. And she like for the longest time she kept saying, "I'm sick." And I'm like, "Where?" And she's like, "My head." And she just would keep saying, "I'm sick." And so I took her to the doctor. She got diagnosed with autism this April. And since she started school, she's doing a lot better. But like in her communication, like she's like 3 to 4 years behind in her understanding, communicating, and all that. But she can talk fine. But right now we're just trying to deal with her, helping her to eat better.
Well, and hopefully, are you here in Utah, Ashley?
Yeah, I'm in Millard County.
Okay, I'm going to send you just some connections for some parent groups because that might be a really great thing for you to connect with. It sounds like it's been super stressful for you, and I'm sure everybody on the call is wanting to dive into giving you ideas. So, but connecting with some parents might be some great ways.
Yeah, that sounds.
Has she seen allergy at all? Like an allergist?
No. And when she was having, she actually had 2 episodes, one in December and one in February. And we actually took her off gluten for a while and limited her sugar. And she like her behavior changed completely.
It's so Dr. Margolis has got a lot of really great resources, and it's interesting because so much of our serotonin is in our gut. And so it is interesting to think about like changes in our gut and how it affects our brain so much. But also you want a child to eat. And so you have to like provide the foods that she's going to want to eat. And so it's this hard balance of offering the foods that you know might make her feel more comfortable, but then offering the foods that you know she's going to eat.
So, anybody else have a question? If not, I'm going to ask you a question, Erin. So, okay, nobody has it. So, Erin, and Ashley just made me think about it. So, we have these major holidays coming up, and they all are around food. And so, when you have a picky eater or somebody that is struggling with that, how do you navigate that, or how do you help parents be okay with it? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think for the child, I tell parents to try to prepare them as well as you can, because sometimes the anxiety comes from the unknown. And so sometimes I shut down a little bit more because I don't know if I'm going to be expected to eat the food, or I don't know what food's going to be there, or I don't know if someone's going to make me sit at the table, or there's a lot of noise and sensory input and different people. So like I try and make books and stories for kids, like about Thanksgiving and about what might be on the table and about what's going to happen, just so that the child better understands. When I worked in the hospital, like, and I did swallow studies, I would send them videos of what was going to happen before, because it really helps to know what the expectation is. And I think I have this conversation with caregivers all the time that get really anxious, especially with, you know, my parents had different expectations for me at mealtime, and grandma says that you just have to let them sit at the table until they eat it. And, you know, if you don't like this, you don't get something else. And why are you making 5 different meals for your kids? And I've found Karen Purvis always says that helping a child feel like unconditionally loved by one person is the best protector of them against any sort of mental health concern or difference. And so my job, I feel like, is always to just empower the caregiver to that they know what they're doing, that they're doing the right thing for their child, and they don't always have to offer an explanation. Like, this is what we've chosen. He doesn't have to sit at the table. I tell them to blame me all the time. This is what we worked on with my therapist. His therapist says this is what we're doing. And that way, I can kind of be like the mom when you want to leave the sleepover, like mom says, I can't do this. And so helping them just feel confident, and the better you can help a parent understand the why behind what's going on with their child, the better they can advocate for them. And so I do that, I feel like we're putting in work all year where it's like, this is why we're doing this. I'm empowering caregivers, this is what's working. You're being such a good advocate for them. And then giving them some like one-liners too to bring to Thanksgiving of like, if someone says this, say this. Like if someone says, why is your child not eating at the table? You let them do whatever they want. Say, this is what makes him feel safe and comfortable. And this is the decision we've made, or, something. And that's hard. I mean, that's easy for me to say as somebody who doesn't yet have kids and who can give all this advice, but like, I don't have to talk to Uncle Tommy or somebody that's upset because he's not eating the mashed potatoes he made. But, also learning that parent too. And the more I know about that parent and their style of communication, the more I can kind of coach them on some of those strategies. But I've found it to be very helpful to tell parents, like, you don't owe them an explanation, and they may not agree with you, and that's okay. But it is really hard when it's a parent or a grandparent and you like want them to approve of you and you want them to approve of what you're doing. But that tends to be my number one advice.
Great. I love that. So thank you. And thank you all for joining today, especially the day before Thanksgiving. Next month in December, we do not have a session because we fall, our last Thursday of the month actually falls on a holiday. So we will be continuing again with this network, January 28th, 2026. It's really painful that next week is December. I cannot believe it. And we will be starting talking about that early identification in girls. I just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to Erin for sharing with us today. It was a wonderful, fantastic presentation. So thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining. Don't forget to complete the survey and enjoy your holiday.